Fashion plays a part in swimming, and I'm not talking about the swimsuits. We're talking about stroke technique today. Don't get too excited. I couldn't possibly do a thorough job of telling all about stroke technique in 15 to 20 minutes or so. Or could I? Okay, I can't, so this is going to be a little longer than usual. This is the Swim Coach Dad podcast, and I'm going into perilous territory again today, going out on that limb with coaches out there sawing away at my branch. Welcome back to the Swim Coach Dad podcast. I'm Victor Swim Club coach Scott Wisner. Just a follow-up for the last podcast, the difference between cats and dogs. I told the story of one of my best friends, a true dog in swimming for sure, and his battle with a notorious cat on our team in the podcast, and how they tied our conference meet in the 100 back in spite of the intense training of the dog and the selective training of the cat. I told the dog he should listen to the podcast because I talked about our teammate and him and that 100 back at the conference meet. His comment was, and how your favorite best buddy with all his heart and soul ran down that lazy, blankety-blank sprinter boy, except he put another profane adjective before sprinter boy. So as you can tell, the scars of the actions of a cat can linger years later on a team. Okay, so on to our topic today called, I read about it in a book, Stroke Technique. I remember seeing a friend of mine in a very cool outfit, and it occurred to me that he was always looking very hip and trendy. This was a long time ago. He had been a fashion merchandising and design major at Virginia Tech, had worked at Ralph Lauren and Kotler, so I was sure he had an inside track to some great clothes. I asked him what his secret was to his fashion, and he told me his dark secret. On the sly, he told me he shopped at Stylish Apparel. I'd never heard of that store before, so when I pressed him, he laughed and said, Salvation Army Outlet. Like, duh. When I asked him to explain, he told me that part of fashion that is classic is what he always looked for. Some styles either don't really go away, or they come back into style eventually. So what does that story have to do with swimming or swimming technique? Well, swimming is a trendy sport. There's a bit of fashion in the way technique, and training for that matter, changes. And the way we come back to the old ways like classic fashion. So why is this? It seems that it comes down to the search for magic, which is kind of weird because the men's fashion show every year in Las Vegas is called Magic. Anyway, the trendy fashion part is based on coaches looking for some new magic, some secret technique that leads to doing more with less, going faster with less energy spent, or just going faster, period. Often it's driven by a swimmer killing the world record or dominating a stroke or event. I've always said that Michael Phelps did nearly as much to hold swimming back as he did push it forward because of this. Once Michael started to dominate, we saw more and more of him on TV with the Olympics and other meets televised. We started seeing all sorts of swimmers doing just like him, breathing every stroke and fly, something that for years was discouraged, but because the best swimmer in the world was doing it, kids all over the world were breathing every stroke. And in my swimming lifetime, I've seen this over and over again. Mark Spitz left his head up a little too long, bent his arms on the recovery and fly, and breathed late and free. Before you knew it, kids all over the world were doing the same thing. Even now, the big-time male swimmers start breathing to one side and doing that catch-up stroke with that limp in it. So now we have tons of kids swimming that way. All right, let's go back to Michael Phelps a little bit and the problem initiated with imitating his strokes. Michael's a fully grown 6'4" male with an arm span of 6'7", which is plus 3 inches on the ape index, which is really, really a long wingspan. He has very long torso and relatively short legs, so he can get away with the technique that wouldn't work well for nearly anyone else in the sport. I remember arguing with a friend of mine who's a coach up north at a SUNY college. He's an Indiana University guy who swam under Doc Councilman, and when an underwater video of Michael Phelps swimming fly came out, what I saw was a flaw in his stroke because he came way too narrow under his body. And what this other coach saw was proof that you have to do the S-pull, which is something that his coach taught. And so the master, as he called Phelps, showed that this is the right way. Let's take another one. If you watch Nathan Adrian and watch underwater how he swims, he uses almost a straight arm pull. And that works for him, but he too is a fully grown, extremely strong, 6'6" tall, 195-pound male who swims the 50 and the 100. Again, don't mistake physical attributes for superior technique. On the other hand, if you take someone like Katie Ledecky, who's been the most dominant female in swimming since 2012, and all people see is this hitch in her stroke or a giddy up, and they think that she's stopping her left hand or causing that uneven motion that way by stopping her hands. But if you look at the underwater video, that isn't at all what she's doing. She keeps her hands moving, doesn't stop them, and pulls in the correct position. She's a relatively tall woman also, about 6 feet tall. So I look at Michael Phelps and I see him swim and I say to myself, okay, he could be faster. And I look at Katie Ledecky and I think, okay, that's how she is going so fast, because it kind of matches up with what I believe. Warren Buffett once said, he's a famous investor, has said, I don't buy stocks in industries I don't understand because I don't understand how they can make money. I'm the same way about stroke techniques that come out. If I don't understand how they make someone go faster, I can't teach or use them in coaching. Perhaps that limits me, but I'm sure it keeps me from jumping on those all too short bandwagons of trendy techniques. Also keep in mind that swimming coaches argue about technique all the time, along with nearly all using their own terminology or terminology that someone else made up. So there are a lot of variations out there. Throughout my time in the sport, there have been a lot of trends in technique. I've become convinced that for some time the technique comes from two directions. For several, most actually, comes from with someone swimming very fast on the world stage, coaches looking at that swimmer's technique and justifying why that's the right way to swim. Several have disguised this by starting out with a how component and then showing the swimmers who use this technique and say, see, the swimmers swim fast because of this, and so this proves the theory works. The catch is that sometimes principles of physics are applied to swimming that don't apply to water or swimming really. Before you know it, hundreds of other coaches are teaching these techniques, and we'll get into some of that in a little bit. Then there are those few who start with basic tools, Newton's laws of physics, basic anatomy, kinesiology, which is the study of human movement. The justification is, since these are called laws of physics and not suggestions of physics, they're unchanging. Also, anatomy is relatively consistent in the human body with some variations, but the average person has the same levers and musculature. So then you have kinesiology part where the human movements are applied to swimming in a substance that is not natural to us, water. There's also the occasional rule changes in the sport that allow different or more extreme movements that can be used, can alter stroke technique, or at least the way swimming strokes are done. An example of this happened in 1988 Olympics with Joseph Szabo of Hungary when he won the 200 breast. Prior to then, some part of the head had to stay out of the water throughout breaststroke. In 1987, the rule was changed and the head could thereafter go underwater. This wasn't on the surface much of a rule change. People were getting away with it. It's just that now it was, part of the rules. Joseph Szabo, to use more of an undulation motion in the stroke like butterfly, was very effective at that. And just before that, in about 1985, another Hungarian, Joseph Nagy, who was coaching in the U.S., developed what he called wave breaststroke with American Mike Berriman. With the rule change, this undulation could be more pronounced and you could get more propulsion. This very much changed the way breaststroke technique was done from then after and changed the kinesiology of the stroke in the process. People started swimming breaststroke differently. Berriman won the gold medal in 200 breasts in the 92 Olympics and broke the world record, and the stroke changed all through. 6 years before that, using that same stroke that won him the gold medal would have gotten him disqualified. So, rule changes sometimes do change technique. Books come out from time to time that talk about technique. That's why the title of this podcast is called I Read About It in a book, Stroke Technique. When I first started, Doc Councilman of Indiana University, and before that he was at SUNY Cortland, had written The Science of Swimming. And his S-pull theory proposed in that all strokes had an S-pull shaped pull on it. Or he used the words inverted question mark was the shape of the pull. Since Councilman was coaching the most dominant college team at the time and was working with some of the best swimmers in the world like Mark Spitz and Gary Hall and John Kinsella and Mike Stam and others you probably have never even heard of, it was taken as gospel. And why not? The science of swimming said it all. All through the science of swimming, there were lots of pictures of the best swimmers in the world from underwater, which in those days took very special and very expensive equipment, so not everybody could do it. And you could see from the pictures that these Olympic gold medalists, world record holders, and national champions were all doing exactly as Councilman explained. The idea was that the hand had to change angle to maintain the pull at the center of gravity and the leverage on the water. I have a few friends who swam for Councilman years later, including the coach up north in the SUNY school. And they still argue with me about the S-pull, and always said without it, it's like pulling on a rope that isn't tied to anything on the other end, something that we totally disagree with. A few years later, in '82, Ernie McGlisco came out with Swimming Faster, a book titled with a lot of promise. He applied Bernoulli's principle of lift and drag to swimming, like the principles used to make an airplane fly. Councilman had explored this in 1971 in his research with R.M. Brown, but McGlisco had distributed his book in a more widespread way by distributing it into the mainstream. You could find it in bookstores. So that's where the idea of I read it in a book, stroke technique, comes from. From that point on, everyone, including a number of parents, would tell me about stroke technique because they read it in a book. The idea here is that your hands are more like the shape of an airplane when we're talking about McGlisco's theories. So it's more like an airplane wing rather than a paddle. So they can be used as a propeller to provide lift to the body. For several years, we heard out sweep, in sweep, back sweep. Years before this book came out, when Coach McGlisco first started putting out his papers on the subject, all sorts of people were looking into this extraordinary development. Of course, a number of coaches took this as gospel right from the start, because that's how some coaches are sometimes. They look for the magic so much that they don't even look to see if it makes any sense. But others were a bit more curious on the why of that technique. I remember watching one of my teammates at Iowa, our best sprinter, a guy named Jim Marshall, swim in the flume, which is it's kind of like an infinite pool if you've ever seen one of those, but it's all glass, so they can measure where you are. And they were trying to have him use the new technique, trying to measure the lift the new stroke provided. He practiced the stroke, and so it wasn't like he was just trying it. He was practicing it to see if he could do it. For years, and he never could get the lift. It just couldn't. Even though when they turned the speed up in the flume to the maximum levers, they couldn't get lift to happen to any kind of extensive degree. So for years, I asked questions about how the technique worked, and I was lectured on the new stroke superiority and how I just was dim-witted and didn't get it. Even a noted coach that worked at ASCA, American Swim Coaching Association, accused me of being stubborn about it. So I talked about this with some of my mentors and coaching friends that were kind of the same school I was. And they questioned whether we were swimming fast enough to actually get lift that way. And they were saying that, the reason a boat lifts up is because of how fast it goes. So we all kind of questioned whether we were actually swimming fast enough to make that useful. Then in 1995 at the American Swimming Coaches Association convention, Ernie finally came clean and apologized to all who were listening, saying he was wrong about the use of lift in swimming and the application of Bernoulli's principle in the water on human propulsion. Of course, for years, we were still hearing coaches profess of the effectiveness of McGlisco's technique, even after Brent Rushall and others debunked his ideas. I even heard it, probably 5 to 10 years ago. So on the heels of McGlisco's lift theory, the fall of it anyways, came Terry Laughlin. His book, Total Immersion, in 1996, and his Front Quadrant Swimming, which gave us years of coaches teaching the catch-up freestyle to lots of swimmers. And like McGlisco, Laughlin distributed his book throughout all sorts of mainstream commercial outlets. You could find it at every bookstore you could imagine. Predictably, his technique was all over the sport, and lots of people, including coaches, swimmers, parents, were talking about front quadrant swimming as if it was the definitive stroke technique and some kind of holy grail. I got a good dose of this years later when my son Kai was just starting out in swimming. I was asked to help coach the club he was on by some old swimming friends on the team who had a son swimming there. Of course, when you're at least 20 years older than the next oldest coach on the staff, you aren't always seen as an asset. As it turned out, the coaches froze me out, and while I was supposed to be coaching, they never allowed me to coach. One of the coaches, whose main credentials were being a soccer coach and having a father who was a swim coach at a local high school, he told me, "You're old school, and I coach new school." This was all to do with the fact that he had read Laughlin's book, and since it contradicted most of what I was teaching swimmers, he considered what he knew was new, and what I knew was old or passé. Ironically, several years later, I received a call from him asking to have lunch. Reluctantly, I accepted, and when we met, he told me his father had set him straight, and he felt ashamed of how he had talked and treated me. This whole technique philosophy he had, his entire library of knowledge came from Terry Laughlin's book, in spite of him not really being able to explain why the technique worked. So when I was a youngest coach, just out of college, and head coach of my first team, I'd go to meets every weekend and hang out with my swimming friends. A guy named Eric McDonald, who was coach at Hamilton College and also coached the New Hartford Knights Swim Club. Steve Bush, who coached Shenango Aquatics, and Larry Van Wagner, head coach of Marist College and Marist Swim Club. He's still there right now. He's still there now. We would stand shoulder to shoulder every weekend, coaching and sharing. They'd all been swimmers at Springfield College and had been coached and taught by Hall of Fame coach Charles Sylvia. Naturally, when they heard my stroke technique corrections with my swimmers using kind of a mixture of different ideas, they would comment. They'd make comments to me, teasing me on what I said to a swimmer and asked how I expected my swimmers to improve when I was violating laws of physics. So they explained to me over and over the straight line application of force, which is Coach Sylvia's theory on stroke technique, and he had written about it in the early 50s and then in a book in 1971. Later, I talked directly with Coach Sylvia several times before he died, and he further educated me on stroke technique, and in his New England way, he was very direct and always, he was very helpful, but he always kind of gave me a chance to say something stupid first, and then he corrected me. So this became my foundation for teaching all strokes, and because it applied Newton laws of physics, anatomy, and kinesiology, it made sense to me. There are three basic ideas that explain the entire philosophy of stroke technique, according to Sylvia. The idea that you're anchoring your hand in the water in a place in the pool, and you're passing yourself by your hand. So your hand enters and exits at the same place. Your hand is a paddle, not a wing or a propeller. And the opposite of forward is backward. It is simple. That's a simple difference. It's also up, down, and to the sides are not propulsive. And that applies to all strokes. It's not just freestyle or butterfly. It's all strokes apply to his theories. If you want to go forward, you need to apply force in the opposite direction. If you push down, you won't go forward. If you push up, you won't go forward. If you stop your hands, you won't go forward. I also believe that the vast majority of shoulder injuries in swimming are caused by poor technique. More specifically, using the shoulder and arms in ways they weren't designed. When someone says their shoulder hurts, usually Coach Mike and I can always tell which shoulder hurts from looking at how the swimmer is swimming and how they're using his or her arms. Another thing I was taught by Coach Sylvia was coaching off and his coaching offspring was that the common language of technique should always be the language of science and anatomy because of its precision and its universal terminology. We use words like elevation of the scapula, medial rotation and elbow flexion, adduction, partial supination. While some say that using this terminology is all too technical and advanced for swimmers, especially young swimmers, to understand, if they're taught these words from the beginning, what they mean, and they know what they mean right from the start, they understand what they mean throughout their career, and everything is consistent. It doesn't matter if they're 10 years old or 20 years old, the language is the same. So then we go on to my association at Victor. I remember it clearly. It was at Brockport in August about 9 years ago. I think it was the LSC championships, long course championships that were there. And we were having the meet at that pool. I saw this crazy man, or rather two crazy men, at the time running up and down the pool during the meet. It's mostly the enthusiasm I was watching. It's sort of like something you just couldn't keep your eyes off of because they were really so enthusiastic. But then I heard one of them say something about adduction and medial rotation to one of the swimmers. And as soon as I could slow him down to talk to him, I asked the coach what he had heard, where he had learned that. As it turned out, it was Mike Murray, and he'd learned it from one of my friends and great mentors, Larry Van Wagner, while he was coaching at Marist College and Marist Swim Club with Larry. It might not seem like much, but it was actually the foundation of Mike's and my coaching relationship together. When you agree on technique, use the same terminology, and have some similar backgrounds, it makes for coaching more consistent, and the swimmers get the same message from both of us. It's an important part of how Mike and I coach. Well, that and this bizarre habit of quoting movies during practice. Like, it's a bold move, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off. When someone goes out too fast in a swim. Okay, so far we haven't talked much about my philosophy about technique. We use an ideal stroke that applies the laws of physics and the best uses of the body to create the optimal stroke. We want to use the shoulder in a particular way that it was designed to be used. That prevents injuries as well. For all strokes, we use the idea that most of the same movements and ideas apply in the same way. The book Mike and I refer to is the book Coach Sylvia wrote in 1970, but it was based on his coaching philosophy since at least the early 50s. This book is a book written for a different reason than all the others, in that it was a textbook used to teach college students how to teach swimming. According to Coach Sylvia, be as inertial as possible and the least muscular. That is, using muscle strength for propulsion and inertia swinging in the hands in the recovery of all strokes. So you want to be relaxed when you're not supposed to be propelling yourself, and you want to be muscular when you are. Sounds simple, but it actually, is an important thing to teach. So using phrases like swing the hands, not the arms, fire and release with firm but relaxed hands, and in practice, to be truly unconscious when you swim, you must first be truly unconscious when you swim, you first must be conscious, meaning that you have to think about your strokes in practice so you don't think of them when you're competing in a meet. So the big four is the basis of every stroke, breaking all strokes down to the same four elements. Elevation of the scapula, that gets the shoulder in the solid position, medial rotation of the shoulder joint and upper arm flexion of the elbow so the fingers end up pointing down and the elbows forward, and the elbow is above the hand. So picture a paddler on a canoe or kayak ready to paddle. That's where the power in the stroke comes from. Then pull back the elbow too soon, drop the shoulder before adduction, and the power is taken out of the stroke. This position also helps keep shoulders from being used improperly and causing injury. If you're in that good solid position in the beginning of the stroke, you're not going to hurt yourself. Then there's adduction, which is bringing the hand and elbow as a unit back so the elbow is at the side, tight to the side of your body at the end of the stroke, and the scapula and the shoulders are pushed down. The hands stay mostly in line with the shoulders in free, front crawl, and in fly, but the key is always having the hands and arms in position to pull straight back in a straight line. The stroke is finished with partial supination, inertial round-off, and recovery, which is a slight turn of the hand toward the body to release the stroke since we don't want to push up or down. If this is done right, the hand and arms swing freely in the recovery. That's why if you see someone like an older swimmer named Janet Evans from the 80s, it looks like she's just swinging her arms, and that's because she is. I mean, she really is using the inertia of her stroke to help her hands recover without using any muscle at all. So, indeed, it is from a book that I got all these ideas, but it's from a very specialized book that Coach Sylvia used. Over the years, I've bought probably 5 more copies of this book. Some I've given away to friends like Michigan women's coach Jim Richardson, who was using Sylvia's ideas for years without realizing it. He might have gotten them from Larry Van Wagner since he had a couple of Larry's best swimmers. I've also loaned a couple of coaches my copies and never got them back, which is kind of like how you lose books in the first place. It's now getting difficult to find copies of this book, so I'm not going to be loaning my copy out anymore. Coach Sylvia also covered the timing of all strokes with COE, meaning continuous, opposite, and equal. Continuous means that in all strokes the hands move continuously, so no stopping the hands in front or at the end of the strokes, especially like breaststroke underneath the chin like we have a bunch of our kids doing. While this sounds like a simple idea, nearly all of our swimmers are guilty of stopping their hands somewhere. It also proves continuous propulsion instead of the speeding up and slowing down of someone doing catch-up stroke that you see on TV a lot. Opposite means the hands are exactly opposite of each other, so in free and back, when one finishes a stroke, the opposite arm starts the pull, so the body is under constant propulsion. In fly and breast, they are exactly opposite of each other. They mirror each other throughout the entire stroke cycle. And in equal, meaning the length, the tempo, the body rotation, the structure of the stroke is the same in both hands throughout every stroke. No catch-up, no hitch, no variation of the pull. Both hands look exactly the same every stroke. So when the hands cross the body or push out or push down or push up, we know these are problems that not only will slow the swimmer down, but also could lead to injury. As we tell our swimmers regularly, and several of you have been told this, your ability to improve is linked to your ability to train consistently and effectively. You can't do that if you struggle with injuries all the time, so we need to work on stroke technique. The problem is that working on strokes during training practices is difficult because each swimmer has different flaws in their strokes, and we're trying to get workout done, so it's kind of hard to do any kind of meaningful work. That's why we believe that one-on-one instruction with a coach is the best way to correct stroke problems and helps make strokes more efficient.